Hello, I'm Bill Botel and welcome to episode 5 of Clocking Corona. In this episode, and episode 6, I'd like to look very closely at how we responded very differently to the arrival in Australia of two great viral menaces. In the early 1980s, the advent of HIV and AIDS, and in January 2020, the emergence in Australia of coronavirus infection. The response in the 1980s to HIV and AIDS was very, very different, organised on very different principles and assumptions to the way in which we dealt with coronavirus in 2020. What happened in the early 1980s? From about October 82 in Sydney, when the first case of this mystery disease was reported, we struggled to understand what was causing the disease. In those days, science was not sure, and it was many weeks, if not months, before it became apparent that this terrible disease was caused by a virus. But increasingly, over 1983, more and more people turned up at doctors in the late stages of terrible infection, and many of them died soon after. And this started increasing at very alarming rates of growth. Dr. Blewett, the health minister at the time, of course, decided to look closely at America, as you would. But there we could see only the response to the disease being governed by politics. There was no real attempt by the American administration to look at the science and the evidence and the facts, and to craft a response that might at least have some hope of averting the infection and changing behaviours. In Australia, therefore, Dr. Blewett struck out on a very different direction. He and the Government of Australia, led by Bob Hawke and backed by the Leader of the Opposition of the day, Andrew Peacock, and his colleagues, decided that we should have a response based on fact, evidence, and the best scientific assessment of what was necessary to do. And this particularly related to persuading young people to change their sexual and other behaviours to at least protect and prevent themselves from being infected. And secondly, of course, we had to care and treat for those who did become infected. And to do that, it seemed obvious to the Parliament, not just the government, that we had to reach out and involve the communities most affected in our response, those most at risk of infection. And the government and the Parliament did so on the basis of trusting the people. There were no secrets. There was no modelling kept secret. There were no meetings behind closed doors whose deliberations were not immediately shared with everybody who needed to be involved in creating and forming the response. To their great credit, the politicians of the day decided that they would convene the meetings, they would fund the response, and then leave it to the experts to get on with it. The scientists, the researchers, and those skilled in the public communications arts who had to persuade the Australian people that this was a serious problem and they had to change their behaviours. Most importantly, at the very top, there was an all-party parliamentary committee formed, and we took the politics out of the response, the politics out of the very big prevention measures that were necessary if we were to have any hope of stemming the spread of HIV/AIDS in Australia. Now, that emergency response lasted from roughly the early 1980s to 1996, when the first effective treatments came online. And we offered some hope to people that it would not be a death sentence, but would transform into a chronic, manageable condition, as indeed it did. And the results are there for all to see. we crafted a world-leading response that was a model for many other countries in the world. We took the lead and we recorded HIV and AIDS figures that in many cases were fractions of the very bad figures recorded in other countries, notably the United States of America. As a result, many hundreds of thousands of young Australians potentially did not succumb to HIV/AIDS infection, and of course a proportion of those did not go on to early and avoidable deaths from AIDS. We have crafted and maintained that response over 40 years because it worked. The big question in the next episode that I want to discuss is why we didn't apply and adapt the lessons we learnt in the HIV and AIDS years when it came to fashioning and creating the response to coronavirus from about January 2020. Thank you very much.